welcome back to Ellie Jean's Culture Craving. I don't know why I sang it. Today we are once again talking about books. I just love books so much, and I want to talk to you about modern classics because I think that modern classics is the way to get into reading classics that for some reason no one talks about. So I have, I think, almost 20 different modern classic books here, and I'm just gonna do like a one word, you will like this if you, why I think it will get you into reading. And basically these are my recommendations from a comparative literature student at UCL who just loves to read. I've been reading classic books for a few years now, and I got into them largely through a lot of these. Fahrenheit 451, I read that at the start of this year and really rated it. I thought it was really good. It's a little bit weird, be prepared for that. It's got kind of 1984 vibes if you like that book, but it's also a good book if you like reading because it's a dystopia where knowledge is very much controlled, books aren't really allowed, and it's about this fireman whose job is to burn all the books. Yeah, you'll like this if you like The Hunger Games and Divergent, those kind of YA books. Memoirs of a Geisha blew me away. It's quite an easy read but also beautifully well written. It's the story of a geisha in 1930s-40s Japan. She grows up learning to be a geisha, and it's about her journey through the Second World War, and you'll like this if you are into stories about interesting women. It's a little bit orientalist, but I think you can enjoy it despite that. If you like reading about other cultures and learning about women's lives across the world, this one's for you. Gone with the Wind, similar vibes to Memoirs of a Geisha in many ways. Obviously not Japanese. It's set in the Civil War in America, and it's about a young girl called Scarlett O'Hara. It's kind of about her whole life and her relationship with this man. It's not like necessarily a romantic relationship, but it's just about kind of their story together. And she's strong, she's confident, she's business minded, she's going against all the stereotypes, and she's a very complex character. I would say probably my first real complex female character that I ever loved, because she's incredibly flawed. The world she's in is incredibly flawed, and she's trying to find her place within it. It's about her struggles and all the people around her and their stories, and it's a 1,000-page book, and I read it in 5 days. I will remember it for life. The Handmaid's Tale. If you like dystopias, I mean, you know The Handmaid's Tale, I probably don't have to say this to you. Really good book, very gripping, makes you consider how you see the entire world. Wide Sargasso Sea. This is really a read if you want to get into books like the Brontes and Austen, but you're not ready. You're not ready for that. Wide Sargasso Sea is, I want to say, like a spin-off of Jane Eyre. It's definitely inspired by Jane Eyre, but it's sort of a post-colonial take on it. It's a very short book, but there's a lot packed into it. It's really good. The Bloody Chamber. This is not easy, but boy is it fun. It's a retelling of several different fairy tales. Some of them you'll know, some of them you won't. It keeps the feeling of the original fairy tales in the sense that they are very grim, in the sense of the brothers Grimm. They are dark, they're very sexual, they are, I don't know, they explore women in a very complicated way, and sort of looking at bodies. It's a gothic retelling of the fairy tales as well. It became one of the most influential pieces of work that I've ever read for me. The Great Gatsby. This one isn't one of my favorites on this list, but I think if you want to get into reading, I think it's one you should start with. It's very much a classic. If you haven't read The Great Gatsby, like, you just really should. It's just one of those books that's referenced in music, films, other bits of literature. Like, you can't really go about reading without having read Gatsby. And it is a good story. It's a romance, but first time I read it I was a bit like, eh. So it depends what you're into. Interview with the Vampire. All these three are from school. I mean, this wasn't actually part of my A-levels, but it was to do with my gothic paper. It very much inspired Twilight, and you see a lot of that in it, and it's just a really good vampire story. If you're into the Vampire Diaries, Teen Wolf, that kind of stuff, and you want to get into classic literature, moving from YA, I really recommend this. The Book Thief. The Book Thief is a little bit more YA, so I recommend it for that because it's quite an easy read. very heartbreaking if you like war stories. But yeah, it's just a good tale. The Lovely Bones. Don't dismiss books like this just because it's, I know it's in the genre of the thriller. A lot of those books tend to be trash. The Lovely Bones is not one of those books. You need to read it. Watership Down, also within this vein. Wind in the Willows, Winnie the Pooh. Watership Down is much more complicated than either of the other two books, which is why I'm recommending it. But again, it's just a really good story, especially if you like nature, the outdoors, thinking about climate change and how we're affecting the natural world. Quite a classic English story as well. Atonement I read in a day. One of the more complicated on this list, I would say. One of the more difficult to get your head around. But even if you don't understand the postmodern complexities of this, I think you could still enjoy the book. Yeah, it's a story about the war, but it's also about several different relationships, and it's about this family, yeah, centered on this very wealthy family and also a crime that happened. Breakfast at Tiffanys is a very short story. Holly Golightly is such an iconic character, and she's inspired so much of our fashion now, I would say. She is the original Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Lord of the Flies, again, I would say is one of those books that you suddenly understand lots of other things. Lord of the Flies is just a massive trope in itself, so look at The Society on Netflix. This is very much a Lord of the Flies inspired. And Lord of the Flies is just a crazy, weird, gory, psychological story that makes you think about human nature. And then there were None by Agatha Christie. This is the favourite Agatha Christie that I've read. I thought it was really gripping. Read like a lot of other thrillers that I've read that are really easy to get into, except they're considered classics, which is a miracle. The Da Vinci Code. Now the reason I include this is it's one of those books that's on every you have to read this before you die list. But when I read it, I found that the plot was very predictable, like insanely predictable. It's like every other just classic story. But what's interesting is it does that in a very academic setting, and it makes you think about the past and historical fiction, and I know it just makes you want to be an archaeologist and think about runes and ancient history and medieval times, and so it gives you that desire to learn without actually taking any brain power to read. The Kite Runner is quite easily written, quite easy to get into, I would say. It's a really good story, pretty graphic at times, bear that in mind, quite violent. You know, it's one of those books that makes you go, God, people are awful, and also fall back in love with the world. It's a really great book. And lastly, to finish off, Bridget Jones's Diary. Now I'm including this as a classic because it is. It's funny, it's witty, it's looking at a woman in a complicated way, which I know in 2021 is not that radical, but in the 2000s when this was written, a woman who was above 7 stone being featured in a novel at all that's written, you know, I mean, and it's not written by a man and it's popular. I mean, that was kind of radical. And so I think you have to read that again to understand so many tropes about women. I mean, so many women in films are the Bridget Jones. Kind of like the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, but for 30-year-old women. She is the blueprint of that, and you see them everywhere. Single women who are just living their life independently and learning to love themselves through that, and all of that stems from Bridget Jones, the book. Although the film is also good. Okay, so those are my, I think, 19 or 18, something like that, modern classics that you should read if you want to get into reading literature. Please let me know how it goes, and go and subscribe because I need more of you guys around. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.